When you think of courage, do you imagine the lion in The Wizard of Oz, or is that just me? It's been a minute since I've watched that film, but I can still hear that cowardly lion say courage in my head. But I find the movie does actually give kind of a decent look at that. I don't know how kind of philosophical or theological the movie's trying to be, but you do learn in it that courage isn't just a gift, something you can just get. It's something that you find out the lion had the whole time, but he had to cultivate that. He had to develop that out of himself. And we're far from Oz today, but we are going to be looking at that virtue of courage, fortitude, as an antidote to some of the things that ail us as society. Our guest today is Dr. O. Alan Noble. He's an associate professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University, a fellow at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. His books include Disruptive Witness, You Are Not Your Own, a fantastic book, by the way, another book on getting out of bed, and forthcoming is To Live Well. To Live Well explores how Christian virtues can offer hope and clarity in a distracted and disillusioned world. And we're going to, again, specifically look at the virtue of fortitude or courage on this particular episode. I'm Jake Doberenz, and this is Christianity Without Compromise, a podcast for Christians who love Jesus but are tired of culture war faith. Now, let's get to rebuilding a faith that actually looks like Jesus. Alan Noble, thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said earlier, a little bit of celebrity, fanboy moment, if you will. Not to be weird about it, but you are somebody I really greatly respect, and I'm glad you got the chance to be on this. I think your book, you Are Not Your Own, is just, I don't know. I keep finding myself coming back to those themes constantly, and I think you kind of did a really good job summing up some of the problems I see in the world, both with the conservatives, progressives, like whatever. It was just like, hey, we have adopted some larger cultural things. So that's why I'm really excited to talk to you.
Yeah.
I am. And so, I mean, I want to kind of jump in. We got some really interesting stuff to talk about. And we always start with a story on this podcast to kind of get us in. And I'm personally comfortable calling you one of the most astute diagnosticians of our modern time for this kind of cultural sickness, if you will, that we face in the West. And I appreciate that so much about your writing and your thinking about culture and things of that nature. But you don't write as somebody that's kind of distant from that, from what's going on in society. You experience it firsthand. And so I would love for you to just sort of talk to us specifically about this struggle with mental health, and then throw courage and perseverance into the mix there. But we'll unpack those virtues a little bit more later. Tell us the story and how you managed to, get out of bed.
Yeah. So I'm glad you appreciated You Are Not Your Own, because what I'm going to do right now is kind of tie several of my books together and tell a little bit of a story. Because you asked me to tell a story. So I'm going to tell a story, and I'm going to tell the story about how these books actually work together. Three of these books. You Are Not Your Own lays out a problem of society, this problem that we are taught that we belong to ourselves, we are our own, and we belong to ourselves. And the argument I make in that book is that it creates a sickness. And I think I do a pretty good job of diagnosing the problem and explaining some of the ramifications of it. But in going around the country and giving talks about this book, one of the complaints or challenges that I heard was, what am I supposed to do about this? And I thought, that's a fair challenge. What am I supposed to do about this? And so To Live Well comes out of that. It's a response to an attempt to help explain how do we act and live in a world that is disordered, like I describe in You Are Not Your Own. But one of the other things that I realized after writing You Are Not Your Own is that there are other reasons why people feel disordered, why people struggle to get out of bed. And I felt that in my own life. I struggle with OCD, and it's not just the disorder and chaos of the contemporary world. Sometimes people struggle from mental health illnesses or afflictions, or it could be any kind of affliction. As I argue in On Getting Out of Bed, there are lots of different afflictions that you can have, mental afflictions, diagnosed and undiagnosed, that'll keep you stuck in bed in the contemporary world. And you've got to figure out a way to live and move in those spaces. For me, that affliction was OCD, and it kept me stuck in bed. And I had to learn the virtue of courage, and that looks like reaching out. That looked like reaching out to my wife, to friends, to pastors, to mental health professionals, to people who could give me the support and help that I needed to get out of bed and to get moving and to get help and to get going. And so, really, these books work in tandem. They're working in tandem. They are a story of, they're in part my story of working through these ideas and learning courage and learning how to persevere and how to endure. One of the things that, I don't know if we'll get into this later, but one of the things about courage is that the better part of courage is endurance. That is enduring hard things. And that's what I had to learn while I was stuck in bed, is how to endure hard things. And so I endured a lot of hard things over a long period of time to get better for myself and my family. And I did.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll I'll call out my own kind of generation. I'm legally Gen Z, kind of on that cusp, Gen Z millennial. I'm like right in those. Depends on your sociologist that you ask. I'm right in those years right there. But of course, there is this kind of stereotype, like, oh, the kids don't want to, do all the hard things. They don't struggle enough, and things like that. There's truth in all of that, of course. You're advocating here this virtue, this thing,
Mm.
courage, that um, does require us, guess what, to do some uncomfortable things. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about this society that has created these very different norms. And one thing you mention is that our culture is full of morality but lacking in virtue. So
Yeah.
help us unpack that a little bit, that difference there,
Yeah.
and talk more about this culture that is kind of creating an environment that isn't necessarily conductive to culture.
Yeah. So we're full of morality. And by that, I mean that we're full of rules about what's right and what's wrong. We don't agree on what those rules are. In fact, we disagree. Everybody's got their own little morality. So we're full of morality. Everybody's got these rules and they're changing all the time. What can you say publicly? What are you allowed to say publicly? Those things change every 5 years. And you can get canceled for it. So we're full of morality, which is what's right and wrong. But we're lacking in virtue. And virtue has to do with habits of behavior, which is oriented toward the good and what you were created for. So it has to do with the telos, your ultimate ends, what you were created for. Whereas morality can be oriented towards the good and what you were created for, or it can just be some arbitrary rule. Don't call someone this, or don't cross this street, or whatever, just because I say so. Um, And just because this is the social norm, just because I feel like this makes me feel bad, just because whatever, right? And so, as a society, I think we tend to be a society driven by moral norms that have to do with our emotions, with what we tend to think makes us feel bad. Rather than what is oriented toward the good, which is glorifying God and honoring Him. And so, what I'm advocating in the book is that we orient ourselves towards virtues. And in the book, I talk about the 7 virtues, the 4 cardinal and the 3 theological virtues, as ways of orienting ourselves towards God, which is the good, and also our end, what we're created for, which is glorifying God and being in union with Christ.
Yeah, and these are virtues that obviously you didn't make up. Like, this
Right.
isn't an Alan Noble original, and some
Right.
of these are old.
Yes.
I mean, certain of these virtues, we go back to Aristotle at least, and so you're not coming up with these kind of things, of course. But in some respects, our society today isn't like against some of these virtues that you're saying. Like, we're talking about courage or fortitude. I mean, I don't know. I haven't met anybody that said, yeah, courage is bad. And in fact, you'll see certain, like, oh, it's so brave of you to stand up for this or that, or to
Right.
change your profile picture to this, or
Right.
something of that nature is,
Yeah.
is courageous in a
Right.
sense. So, kind of how do you kind of define this term here, and maybe how to use it a little differently than what the
Yeah.
average Joe or Jane might?
So courage, as I'm going to define it, and I'm pulling from a Thomas Aquinas scholar named Joseph Pieper, who's pulling from Thomas Aquinas, who's pulling from Aristotle, and so this is a long chain of scholars pulling from scholars. Um, Courage is enduring the risk of suffering for the good. So it's enduring the risk of suffering for the good. And all of those pieces are important. Another way of putting it would be being vulnerable for the good. And all of those pieces are important. If you are being vulnerable, risking vulnerability for something that is not actually good, then you're just being rash. So, for example, if I go and I climb the face of a mountain without any, harnesses or something like this, that's not a good. That's not glorifying to God or honoring somebody or making the world a better place. That's just taking a risk. That's just making myself vulnerable because of a thrill. Okay. So that's not a good. Okay. So that's just thrill seeking. That's not courage. Now you can say it's fearlessness, and it's certainly that. It's certainly that. But fearlessness is not always the same thing as fortitude or courage. A lot of people are fearless, but they don't have courage. And so we want to make a distinction between those two things. Sometimes fearlessness is actually a bad thing. Sometimes fearlessness can lead you to make bad decisions, to rush into danger when you should be wise and think about what you're doing. And so part of it has to do with the good. And also part of it has to do with making yourself vulnerable. And so one aspect of courage is that you have to risk vulnerability. And we tend to be careful or apprehensive about making ourselves vulnerable. We don't want to make ourselves vulnerable. It's scary to make yourself vulnerable. We want to protect ourselves. That's a natural thing. But courage requires us to make ourselves vulnerable. And so courage is when you make yourself vulnerable and risk suffering for a good, ideally the good, which is God's glory. Now, to answer the second half of your question, you asked, well, how is this different than sort of the world's, the way the world uses courage? And so when we flippantly use the word courage, or is somebody being brave or something like this, what I argue is, especially in the book, is that we typically talk about somebody being courageous when they do something to announce their identity. And we use this in a very narrow sense. So we'll talk about somebody standing up for their identity, um, and that's what being courageous tends to be today. Announcing your identity, expressing yourself is courageous today, and I think sometimes that can be an act of courage. But I think that's a very narrow definition of courage. I think we've reduced it to a very narrow sense, and it's actually much more expansive than that. And that we need to think much bigger than that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking too. Like, yeah, there's a narrow version in society. You mentioned vulnerability as a part of it. The buzzword these days is authenticity.
Yeah,
But again, that has even been co-opted in some kind of weird ways. What does it mean to be authentic? Does it mean I just say anything that comes into my mind? Guess what? It's probably not going to be super helpful. Speaking for myself, it would not be super helpful
yeah,
if I said everything that came to my mind. Is that what being authentic is? That what being vulnerable is? And so, yeah, there's a sense in which we have to kind of look at that and figure out. And if you add the for good part too, you know, standing up and saying, I do like pineapple on pizza. Is that courageous? I don't know. Depends on your opinion, I guess. Depends on
yeah,
everybody's opinion. But then again, what good necessarily does that do? I
yeah,
suppose.
yeah,
Maybe if it, lessens the stigma or something. I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful here. I think. I am somebody that is my stubbornness leads me to maybe be more of that kind of fearlessness and to say things and not think of take risks or whatever. Uh, but that isn't always necessarily courageous. It's good to think about that, and I appreciate thinking about the good element of that. Now, in your book, "In to Live Well," you have to talk about suffering. To talk about many of these virtues, including courage, we got to talk about the bad stuff. And again, not to throw my generation under the bus because too many people do that, and I think it's kind of mean. But again, there is this culture in which let's remove the suffering, let's remove the bad stuff. Um, and let's be real, I kind of like that. I don't really like things to be hard or bad or
Right.
difficult. Um, so why do you think we need kind of this suffering for the cultivation of some of these virtues, including courage that we're talking about today?
Yeah. So, you know, suffering is going to come whether we like it or not. That's a part of life. And as I mentioned earlier, endurance is the better part of courage. And endurance helps us deal with suffering. Um, so Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas both say that there are two parts of courage. There's a part that's attack. So that would be like a fireman rushing into a burning building to rescue children, or a warrior rushing into battle, right? And then there's endurance. So that's when you just have to stand there and take vulnerability. And a lot of times in life, that's what suffering asks us to do. We just have to stand there. It's like when you get the flu and you can't fix it. You just have to sit there or lie there, as the case may be, and endure the flu until you get better. Um, that's a lot of life, is enduring suffering. You can't fix it. You can't just make it go away. You just have to endure it and wait for it to get better. Our society believes in something called technique. And I talk about this in You Are Not Your Own. this idea of maximizing efficiency in every sphere of human activity. And I get this from this French sociologist, Jacques Ellul. And so this is this idea that you have to improve everything and make it efficient, maximally efficient as possible. And so that means that if there's some problem in your life, you've got to improve upon it. You've got to find some efficient way to fix it. You've got to find some efficient way to fix it. Well, sometimes if you apply that strategy to every sphere of your life, what you're going to discover is that you're not going to get used to hard things. You're not going to grow resilience. You're not going to grow the ability to deal with bumps and bruises and scrapes and difficulties. You're going to expect that things have to go smoothly and efficiently. And I think that's our society. We have this expectation that problems must be solved, that everything must be fixed, that we shouldn't have difficulties, that we shouldn't have problems and heartaches, that there should be a pill to solve our problems, that there should be, and I'm not saying that it's a problem that you shouldn't seek solutions to your problems, but I am saying that at a societal level, at a holistic level, if we don't accept that suffering is a part of life, then we don't learn the lessons that suffering offers us. And we don't learn the lessons. And one of those lessons is the cultivation of courage through endurance, which is the better part of courage. And what happens through suffering is that we learn that we can persevere. We learn that we can persevere. And this is a biblical concept, that we can persevere. And then through perseverance, we gain character, and we learn to trust in God, and we learn to have the courage to endure through hard things, that we can do hard things, that we're capable of lasting through hard things. And so that's one thing I worry about. And I don't think it's just this generation. I think it's multiple generations, but it is a problem. And I think being risk adverse is a problem. If we are too risk averse, if we're not willing to be vulnerable, because remember, that's part of the definition of courage, is being vulnerable. If we're risk averse, then we're not open to vulnerability, then we're not open to gaining the virtue of courage.
Yeah, I've talked on this podcast sometimes about my own history of suffering. Basically, between 2022 and 2023 was kind of my own Job moment. Just lost love interests and jobs and a cat, and then it ended with the death of my father, who was relatively young. And it's like, as miserable as that time was, and it was very miserable. Do not recommend. Just on the other side of that now, just the character that has formed in me, the things that I decided to do differently. I'm a different person, and I believe I'm better for it.
Yeah.
Um, and again, it's like, I don't wish that on anybody. I'm not
Right.
necessarily, you need some more suffering here and there.
Right.
Although there's a whole another conversation about, I remember a sermon once about praying for your enemies to suffer in so that they change. That's an interesting one, but that's a different subject.
Yeah.
There's some benefits here, and we have to recognize that. And I'm glad you brought up that guy, Mr. Jacques
Yeah.
here.
There he is.
Yeah, you are the one that introduced me to him, and I am trying to read his book, The Technological Society.
Yeah.
This book has just the smallest print you ever seen in your
I
life,
know.
and
It is.
it's really thick. But I appreciate that, because one of the things he says, and you mentioned this too, it's not like we just invented efficiency with this generation or something like that.
Right.
Like, this is actually a very ancient human problem. It just has expressions differently over time. But yeah, that whole framework is something. That's the reason I'm reading that book, because through your work, through You're Not Your Own specifically, I have found that what a good kind of diagnosis of what's going on
Yeah.
here. Um, and it's yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. That's a good framework. I think that's important
Yeah.
to mention, especially because I love efficiency. I love all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Right.
Um, and that's the water I'm drinking these days. Boy, oh boy. Well, I'll force a segue here because another thing I deal with that I have dealt with a lot in my life is kind of this idea of the God ordained one right thing, the one path. What is my job? We talked a little bit before the call, before the interview. I used to be a teacher, so that was a hat I wore for a while, trying to figure that out. And now, I do podcast production and marketing and things, like very different. And so I've done all the different things trying to chase the one right thing, and this is something that comes up in your book, in To Live Well a little bit. Um, and like, man, I see this choice paralysis all
Mm.
around me. I experience this. I mean, there's so many choices. Everybody's telling you this is the right path. It kind of goes back to that morality that you talked about. This is what you got to do. This is the thing. But it gets imported into Christian circles, and that's what I'm talking about here. This idea
Yeah.
of God has this one path for you. You got to get on board, or else, I don't know, you're sinning or
Yeah.
something's bad. So, I mean, all that to say, how does fortitude and courage play a role in this world that's trying to tell us this is the one thing you got to do, this is the right thing, get on board, or else?
Yeah. I think courage is important. It plays a part in a number of ways. But I would say more important is the virtue of prudence,
Mm, yeah.
for deciding, for helping to navigate what is the right career path, and what is the right romantic relationship, and what is the right major to major in, and what is the right college to choose, and those sorts of things. So using the virtue of prudence is the place you have to start with. But courage still factors in because at the end of prudence is acting decisively. The final step in prudence is acting decisively. You have to go through this process. I won't go into the details because we're focusing on courage today, but you have to go through this process of evaluating reality and such, and then you have to act decisively. You have to come to a decision, then you have to act decisively, and that requires courage. You have to make a choice and you have to act courageously, and you don't get to know with absolute certainty that you have chosen the right career path. You don't get that knowledge. You don't get most of us aren't tapped on the shoulder by God and told this is the path for you, and that's okay. We get to choose a career path using the virtue of prudence, which is wisdom. We choose a path that is honoring to God, and then we go down that path, and then using courage. And if that path turns out to be something that is not suitable to us, then we use courage to not buy into the sunk cost fallacy, which is something that I talk about in the book. Right. So we don't want to continue to make poor decisions once we realize something is not working for us. And so then we reassess our situation and we make a new decision. Right. And that's what it sounds like you made with teaching. You were going down a certain path and you reassessed your situation and you said, okay, well, this is not for me, so I'm doing something different. And so that's what we all have to do in life with lots of decisions, all kinds of decisions. We make choices and we use courage to strike out on those decisions, to act decisively. And this is important. James talks about you know praying for wisdom and not being someone who doubts and is blown about with doubts. And I think this is important, that we not be allowed doubts to blow us around and cause us to second guess ourselves to death, because that can eat you up inside. You can, FOMO can get to you, or anxiety can get to you, or you can always be looking over your shoulder at some other job, or other person, or saying, I could be in a different relationship. And you have to learn to be content and make a choice and live the consequences, unless there's some overwhelming evidence that you've otherwise.
I appreciate all of that. Again, that question was really just more selfishly for me. I needed
Yeah,
that encouragement. But yeah, it was middle school that really scared me off. That's not
that'll
part of my plan. The middle school kids. Um, Although the problem was I love them too much. It was not a great learning environment for them because it was chaos incarnate. But they're awesome still, and teaching is probably still on the cards in some way, shape, or form. But I kind of bringing it back to suffering. I learned a lot through that. The
yeah,
different paths you take, but thank you for mentioning that sunk cost fallacy, because I see a lot of people fall into that. I
yeah,
saw a lot of that in college. People would be like, well, my dad and mom said I have to major in pre-med, and I hate it, and I don't want to do this, and I guess I'm
yeah,
just going to finish it. I mean, there's obviously virtue in finishing what we start and things like that. Got to
right.
apply wisdom to it, but boy, oh boy, it's a good reminder. So, we're kind of barreling to the end of time here, of our time together. Rather, you definitely whet people's appetites for the rest of the book, and maybe for all your other books too. So
Yeah,
we got like a four, five, however many books you've written for
yeah,
one special here. So that's great. But kind of as this last question before we get to the plugs, and then before we get to our final question about practical action, if you just kind of, and you have had this opportunity, if you had sort of the ear of churches, of church leaders, church
yeah.
communities, and you want to just talk about the formation of virtues in
Mm.
general, what kind of advice would you say to these communities about the need, or about about implementing virtue formation here? Talk to them for a second.
Yeah. Well, I would say for churches, I think the important thing is to start using, or to continue using, language of virtue. Uh, I think there's power in recovering language of virtue. We already use the theological virtues. We talk about faith, hope, and love, but we may not be talking about temperance. We may not be talking about prudence. We may not be talking about fortitude. And so I think there's value in actually just naming these things and bringing them up, and in sermons, for example, and just talking about the value of these things, so that it's a part of the language that a church culture uses to express itself, to talk about itself. And the same thing, I think, in institutions. It should be part of the cultural language, that we talk about virtues as a part of our language, because that's how it becomes ingrained in people, is when you use that language of virtue. When people know that justice is important, is an important part of it. When prudence is an important part of the way we make decisions. Um, Thinking through things prudently. You know, um, I think that's the way we go through and make institutional change, is just changing our language. I think is important. Uh, that's what I would say. Yeah.
It dawned on me while you were talking, like, is one of the issues maybe we run into churches, there's sort of this idea of like, just preach the gospel, or only talk about the spiritual things. um And what you're advocating here, well, what the church has advocated for a long time, these virtues, these decision making things, like Jesus actually affects our whole being, our whole life, right? It's not just faith, hope, and love. It's more than that. And I don't know, maybe there are some churches that struggle for whatever reason to extend that because they feel like that's to get into the cultural or whatever, or because they haven't been taught properly that like Christ matters for the whole thing, all of our being. I don't know. That's a thought that came to mind. Because you're right, that language is important, but I don't hear churches talk about that as much as those theological virtues. Talk about the other virtues. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, the Bible has a lot to say about justice, for example. So it's
Sure.
like it's not. And Paul has a lot to say about temperance, even though he
Mm-hmm.
doesn't use language of doesn't use that word temperance, but he has a lot to say. I mean, when he talks about sacrificing to idols, when he talks about you know you know food and drink. I mean, he's talking about temperance, and so I'm what I guess what I'm asking is we just use that language, and so. But you're right. We tend not to. We shy away from it, and part of it is a Protestant thing, and it sounds a little too Roman Catholic, and it sounds a
Sure.
little too works based, and part of my effort is to say it's not. It's if we understand it properly, if we understand that practicing the virtues is not something we do in order to earn God's favor, but because we have God's favor as beloved children of God, then it's a very Protestant thing. Um, then then there should be no problem.
Well, amen. Actually, what a great way to wrap things up right there.
Yeah, there
That
you
was
go.
good, right? Um, yeah, this is a reflection of who we are as followers of Jesus. That's what Christianity without compromise is all about. We love it. We love it. So now's the part of the show where we talk about kind of what you want to point people to. Obviously, we've been talking about this book, To Live Well, which is coming soon when this episode comes out. Um, where do you want to point people to for that, or some of your other writings and works?
Yeah, so you can find To Live Well. So it'll be out April 28th. And so you can find it, or it should be, and you can find it wherever good books are sold, or mediocre books are sold, or bad books are sold, probably. And you can find me at oalannoble.com. You can find my Substack through there, and you find me writing regularly through that. And yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll be requesting it to some local Oklahoma City bookstores here. For sure. That's how I like to do it. And I've actually seen one of your books at a local at Full Circle Books in Oklahoma City. So we'll add this one to their shelves too.
Yeah, that'd
Yeah,
be
I
great.
like it. Great. Okay, well, now's the part of the show where I ask every guest the same exact question, worded the same way, because as your whole book does, we want to leave somebody with some practical stuff. We don't want to just be doom and gloom. And we were definitely not doom and gloom today. Very encouraging, but leave us with something here. So here's the question that I ask everybody. As we close, leave the audience with just one practical action they can do this week to live out their faith fully for Jesus.
I would say go get to know somebody really well. Go take them out for coffee, ask them some probing questions in a loving way, not in an invasive way, obviously, and get to know them really well because there's a lot of people out there who have burdens that they're carrying that they haven't shared with anyone, and they need someone to just ask them questions, and they need other people to carry those burdens with them. And so you need to come along and ask them the right questions.
Oh, that's a really good one. Yeah, I would consider myself a former introvert. I think I've switched in my old age, but definitely, yeah. Sometimes we want to be asked these questions. We're all dealing with stuff, and hey, human relationships. Love them. They're great. God loves them too, by the way. And what a great way to cultivate virtues and all of that. Beautiful. Well, Dr. Alan Noble, thank you so much for being on
Yeah.
Christianity Without Compromise today. We super duper appreciate it. We also end the episode with kind of a sharing challenge, thinking whoever's listening to this, hey, who can you share this episode with today? And so today, I mean, those new relationships you build, share this episode with them, but also think about who needs some courage in their life, who might benefit from that conversation about courage, about fortitude. Think of somebody that comes to mind there. Go ahead and share that episode. And then, of course, pick up Alan's book when that does come out, or pre-order it. If that's a thing that's out now, all of that jazz. So I want to encourage you guys to do that. And thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah. Happy to. Thanks.
This episode of Christianity Without Compromise was hosted by me, Jake Doberenz, and produced by Theophany Media, my podcast production company. If this conversation served you, please rate and review the show and share it with a friend and help others find it. You can also subscribe at jakedoberenz.substack.com to get email updates with new episodes every Tuesday and my often humorous theological reflections on Fridays. And as always, don't just listen, live it. Live out that Christianity without compromise. Thanks for listening.